Looking at fed and fasting states is a helpful way to think about how things happen metabolically in the body. So really, our bodies were designed so that we could undergo periods without eating, so that we don't have to have a constant fuel source. So there's really this interplay between the organs on utilizing different fuel sources depending on how long ago it was that we ate. So the fed state is kind of from the time we eat until about maybe 3 hours or so after eating, and then the post-absorptive state starts and lasts maybe 12 to 18 hours after eating. And then we move into kind of that early fasting stage. And then if it goes long, then it's going to be starvation. So different things happen metabolically depending on how readily available fuel sources are. So essentially, the longer we go without eating, the more our body shifts to being able to survive without a fuel source. So it taps into the sources that are available in storage in our body, primarily lipids. This figure is an illustration kind of showing how things happen in the fed state. So when we eat, of course, the food goes, food goes into our gut, into our gastrointestinal tract, into our gastrointestinal tract, where we know it's digested and then absorbed from there. So theoretically, we could have amino acids from protein, glucose from carbohydrates, and triacylglycerols from fats. Now, of course, any given meal might not have all of those, but we'll kind of look at what would happen if all of those were in the system. So starting with amino acids from the breakdown of protein, those primarily go into the liver initially, with the exception of branched chain amino acids, which can bypass the liver and go directly to the muscle or the adipose tissue, which is why sometimes branched chain amino acids are used in particular situations. For example, if there's liver dysfunction, or looking if we're trying to get amino acids rapidly into muscle tissue, and that sort of thing, because they have a different metabolic pathway. But the other amino acids go into the liver, and then what the liver does with them really depends on what the body needs in terms of amino acids. So it may use non-essential amino acids to make some of the essential amino acids. It may repackage whatever needs done. That pretty much happens in the liver, and then those are transported out to other tissues as needed. Again, those can be then built into proteins for muscle tissue if necessary, or can even go into adipose tissue. The glucose, as we know, is a primary fuel source, particularly in the fed state. So glucose goes into the liver. It can be converted to pyruvate, and then that can be used to go through the Krebs cycle or TCA cycle and electron transport chain to produce energy. It can be used to make triacylglycerols, which then can be transported out into circulation to either be stored in adipose tissue if we have excessive energy, so going down this route to make fatty acids, and then to store those triacylglycerols in adipose tissue. Or they can be transported, the lipids can be transported to other places in the body that they're needed. So kind of, again, it all is based primarily on what the body needs. Some other options for glucose, and glucose really is that key energy source. It's our body's primary fuel source. So if we have plenty, it can also be converted to glycogen for storage. So we know that glycogen is stored in the liver as well as in muscle tissue. So we can go down this pathway. If the glucose goes into the muscle, it can also be stored as glycogen in the muscle. Glucose is the primary and preferred fuel source for the central nervous system. So when we look at things like brain cells, they prefer glucose. We'll look at this when we look at the fasting state, but the central nervous system can use alternate fuel sources like ketone bodies, but the preferred source is glucose. Red blood cells have an absolute need for glucose, so certainly the glucose will go to red blood cells for a fuel source there in the fed state. And then triacylglycerols from lipids in the fed state primarily are transported throughout the body in the form of chylomicrons. So we remember that when we talked about lipid absorption and transport, that chylomicrons move those lipids around the body. And when we have plenty of fuel available, those chylomicrons and transporting the fatty acids will likely go into adipose tissue for storage. And then whatever is left of the chylomicron or the chylomicron remnants will go back to the liver for processing, degradation, and anything that's left gets repackaged in the liver and then transported and used as needed. This image is illustrating what happens in the fasting state and moving into even the starvation state. So how our body kind of shifts with the metabolic fuels that are used. So in this image where there's solid lines like this here, that's reflecting more of the long-term starvation state, where these broken lines are those earlier fasting states in those first couple of days. So again, remember that the liver is really the key place that much of this activity happens when our body needs to basically have fuel but doesn't have fuel readily available, so we're not in that fed state. So we do have a bit of amino acids in the liver, and some of those, many of those, can be converted to glucose. So those are the glucogenic amino acids. Remember, there are some amino acids that are ketogenic that cannot make glucose, but the majority of amino acids can. Lactate can also be converted to glucose in the liver, so that's another fuel source when we don't have glucose readily available. And then glycerol, remember, comes from the backbone of the triacylglycerols. So remember, fatty acids are made up of that glycerol backbone, or excuse me, triacylglycerols are made up of the glycerol backbone and then the fatty acid tails. And so the glycerol aspect of that, which is the very, very small amount of the triacylglycerol, can be converted to glucose. The fatty acids, as we talked about before, cannot be converted to glucose, but they can make ketones. Whoops. So those fatty acids can make ketones, which is an alternate energy source. So really the key concept here is that glucose is the primary fuel source that our body wants. And so even in the fasting state, our body tries to compensate for not having glucose available from food by converting these other sources when possible to glucose. And then when there's still a lack of fuel sources, then it relies on other fuel sources where it can, like these ketone bodies. Of course, the fatty acids can go down the metabolic pathway to produce ATP, which clearly is what our body needs for energy. So the glucose, again, kind of shows these pathways can be used by the central nervous system, which is the preferred energy source. Ketones can also be used by the central nervous system when necessary. So those are kind of some of those initial aspects. Of course, adipose tissue, when we are in a fasting state, is going to break down some of these triacylglycerols into fatty acids and glycerol. And those feed up into the liver for what we just looked at, so the liver can then use those to convert them either to ketone bodies or to glucose. And again, of course, the ATP can be used or can be produced by the fatty acid breakdown. In our muscle tissue, this is another active, metabolically active place. So when we're in a state of fasting or post-absorptive state, but particularly the longer we go in fasting, our muscle cells are where the primarily protein is stored, if you want to think about it that way, because our muscles are made of protein. So our muscles really have the largest protein pool in the body, although of course we don't really want to use that for a protein source, but when our body needs it, we can. So again, of course, the protein breaks down to amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. And then again, those can be fed back up into the liver to do the functions up there that we talked about. There is also glucose available in the muscle tissue, and remember, muscle is a place that glycogen is stored, so the glycogen can be broken down to glucose when needed and utilized, and can be also converted to lactate if necessary to be used as a muscle source. Again, this kind of shows how ketone bodies can be used by the muscle tissue for energy, and fatty acids can also come in and be used for an energy source. Red blood cells, again, we talked about this, that they need glucose, and so the body will break down what it can from the amino acids and the lactate and the glycerol to produce that glucose for those cells that absolutely need glucose. So the pathway comes down here for red blood cells so that they get their glucose stores. So just kind of, again, thinking about how these fuel sources shift when we haven't eaten recently.